The laughter started before the preacher reached the second line. It was not loud. It was the kind of laughter that a crowd produces when one person starts it and two or three others decide, in the span of a breath, that they agree. A sound like something tearing softly. It came from the left side of the Bear Creek Ridge Church, from the pew where the Alderton women sat in their good wool coats. And it moved through the congregation the way a draft moves through a room, invisible until you felt it on the back of your neck. Nora Fenn stood at the front of that church in her brown traveling dress, which was the best dress she owned and which fit her the way her dresses always fit her. Built for a woman of her size, which was a substantial size, and not apologizing for it. She was holding a small bunch of dried flowers the preacher's wife had pressed into her hands at the door. Her hands were steady. The preacher had stopped reading. The whole church had gone into an awful, lopsided quiet, half embarrassed and half waiting. Wyatt Cade stood beside her. He had not laughed. If something in you just went still with anger, stay right here with me. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story reaches tonight. Because what happens in the next 60 seconds inside that church is the reason people in Bear Creek Ridge, Montana, talked about Wyatt Cade and Nora Fenn for the rest of their lives. She had come west on the understanding that it was a practical arrangement. The letter from the Territorial Placement Agency had described it plainly. A widower of 38, rancher, Bear Creek Ridge, Montana. 2 children, Lily, age 9, and Thomas, age 6. The man sought a wife and housekeeper. The agency sought a woman of sound character and domestic competence. The letter had not asked for a description of the applicant beyond her age, her health, and her occupation. Nora had noted that omission and had decided to trust it. She was 31 years old. She was large, had been large her whole life, broad-shouldered and full-figured in a way that had defined the way the world treated her before she had ever said a word to it. She had grown up in Emporia, Kansas, the second of 4 daughters of a dry goods merchant, and had worked in her father's store until his death, and then in the store of a neighbor who paid her less than her father had, and who watched her with a particular expression she had learned, by the time she was 25, to simply not return. She had learned other things too. She had learned that stopping gave them the satisfaction of watching you process it. She had learned to keep her face like a still pond. Whatever moved underneath was hers alone. She had applied to 3 agencies before the Montana one accepted her file. The first 2 had returned her application with letters that were polite and said nothing useful. The third had asked for a daguerreotype. She had sent one, a good one taken by the photographer in Emporia, who had the skill to catch a person as they actually were, and she had never heard back. The Montana agency had not asked for a picture. The wagon driver who met her at the Bitterroot station was a laconic man named Grubb, who drove the supply route to Bear Creek Ridge twice a week and who had, apparently, been asked to collect the new Cade bride along with 60 pounds of flour and a crate of lamp oil. He had looked at her when she stepped off the stage, looked at her trunk, and said nothing for the full 11 miles to the ranch, except to point out, at the base of the mountain road, that it would be icy the rest of the way and she should hold on to something. "The children know you're coming," he said, when the ranch house came into view. "Wyatt told them last week." "What did he tell them?" Nora asked. Grubb considered this for a moment. "That somebody was coming to help." The ranch sat on a long shelf of land below the ridge, with the mountain at its back and the valley floor below, and the whole thing buried under 8 inches of January snow, so new and even it looked like the world had been replaced overnight. The house was larger than she had expected. 2 stories, a long porch, a barn with a fresh coat of red paint on the south wall that someone had applied recently and with care. The fence lines were straight. The woodpile was immense, stacked to the height of a man under a lean-to roof that had been built specifically to keep it dry. Whatever grief had visited this house, it had not taken the man's ability to prepare for winter. Wyatt Cade met her on the porch steps. He was a tall man, not lean but not yet heavy. Somewhere in the middle, the way working men in their late 30s often are, with the particular physical solidity that comes from a decade of doing everything yourself. He had a dark beard going gray at the jaw and eyes the color of the mountain in February, which is a gray-blue that contains no warmth but is not unkind. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand before he speaks about it. "Miss Fenn," he said. "Mr. Cade." He took her trunk without asking and carried it up the steps. She followed. On the porch, pressed against the wall in the cold, were two children. Thomas, 6, was looking at the snow. Lily, 9, was looking at Nora with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who has been told that someone is coming to help and has been forming opinions about what that might mean for several days. "I'm Lily," she said. "Thomas won't talk to you today. He doesn't talk to new people the first day." "That seems reasonable," Nora said. Thomas, without looking up from the snow, moved approximately 3 inches closer to her boot. It was barely perceptible. Wyatt, who had turned to hold the door, saw it. He said nothing. But something in his shoulders changed. She had been given 3 weeks before the wedding, which was the term the agency had stipulated. A settlement period, it was called, during which both parties could assess the arrangement and withdraw without penalty. 3 weeks was enough time to learn the shape of a household and not nearly enough time to learn the shape of a man. What she learned about Wyatt in 3 weeks was this: he was fair and he was quiet, and he was still carrying something so heavy it had altered the way he moved through rooms, carefully, as though he did not want to disturb anything, as though the wrong gesture might break open whatever he was holding closed. His wife, Clara, had died 14 months ago. Fever, then pneumonia, then 4 days that Grubb had described on the drive-in as days he did not wish to talk about. Wyatt had not remarried the idea of another woman. He had remarried the idea of his children having a mother, which was a different thing and which Nora understood completely, because it was precisely the kind of practical, careful grief she knew how to be useful to. She cooked. The kitchen came to life the way kitchens do when a capable woman takes possession of them, not through any single dramatic act, but through the accumulation of small competencies, the right things in the right places. The stove damped down correctly at night, so the coals held through to morning. The larder organized, so nothing was wasted and nothing ran low without warning. On the 5th day, she found a joint of venison that had been stored incorrectly and was beginning to turn, and she repurposed it into a stew with dried onion and juniper berry before Wyatt came in for supper, and he ate 2 full bowls without saying anything about it, and then looked at the pot on the stove. "Clara used juniper," he said. "To the pot, not to her." "It grows on the south slope," Nora said. "I saw it coming in." A pause. "It does," he said. That was all. But he had said it. Said Clara's name, which Grubb had told her he never did, and said it in a tone that was not devastated but simply true. The tone of a man who had been carrying a name in silence for 14 months and had, for one sentence, set it down. Thomas spoke to her on the 8th day. He came into the kitchen before breakfast and stood beside the stove, where she was turning salt pork in the pan, and said, without preamble, "Lily says you're going to be our mother." "I'm going to be your father's wife," Nora said. "That's a little different." He thought about this. "What's the difference? Your mother was your mother because she made you. I'll be your father's wife because we decided to." She turned the pork. "But I intend to do the work either way." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down at the table, which was where he sat every morning from the 8th day onward. On the 14th day, Lily brought Nora a piece of birch bark with something drawn on it in charcoal, a figure that was clearly meant to be a woman, large and solid, standing in front of what was clearly meant to be the ranch house. She set it on the kitchen table and went out without explaining it. Nora looked at it for a long time. Then she put it in her apron pocket. It was the midpoint of the settlement period, and what had not yet happened was any sense that Wyatt Cade saw her as a person rather than a solution. He was courteous. He was fair. He paid attention to small things. The water barrel refilled before she had to ask, a loose hinge on the pantry door remedied between supper and dark. But there was a quality to his courtesy that kept a careful distance, and she had noticed it and had decided that 3 weeks was not enough time to close that distance, and that perhaps that was fine. She was not here for his warmth. She was here for his children and his house and the life that came with it. What she had not prepared for was the Aldertons. She learned about them on the 17th day, when Grubb came with supplies and stayed for coffee and told her, in the way that people deliver information they believe you require, that the Alderton family, a mother and 3 daughters who ranched the next property west, had expected, since Clara's death, that Wyatt Cade would eventually marry the eldest Alderton daughter. That the eldest Alderton daughter was, by all accounts, a fine-looking woman of 26. That the Aldertons had apparently not been informed that Wyatt had sent to an agency and that the matter was essentially settled. Because when Grubb had mentioned it in town on Tuesday, the look on Vera Alderton's face had been, in his words, something to remember. Nora listened to all of this with her hands around her coffee cup. "She'll be at the church," Grubb said, not unkindly. "I expect she will," Nora said. That evening she sat in her room and let herself feel it. Not the fear of Vera Alderton, but the larger, older fear underneath it. The one she had been managing since Emporia. The fear that she would do everything right and it would not matter. That competence and steadiness and goodwill were not, finally, sufficient armor against a room full of people who had already decided what they thought of her before she opened her mouth. She sat with it for a while. She did not let it stay longer than she had time to spare. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and set the bread for the morning. The ceremony was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday of January at the Bear Creek Ridge Church, which held perhaps 70 people and was full. It was full because Wyatt Cade was a known man in that valley, and because a wedding in January was an event worth attending, and because word of the agency bride had circulated for 3 weeks and the town had formed opinions about it in the way that small towns form opinions, thoroughly and largely in advance of the facts. The Aldertons were in the left pew, 4 of them. Vera Alderton and her mother and 2 younger sisters, all in their best wool. Vera was indeed handsome, dark-haired, narrow-shouldered, wearing the expression of a woman who is maintaining composure through the specific discipline of someone who believes she is owed something and is watching it be given to someone else. Nora walked in on Grubb's arm because there was no one else to walk with. And she walked the length of that aisle in her brown traveling dress in front of 70 people, with her hands around her dried flowers and her face the way she had learned to keep it. Still water, nothing given away. She had felt the room's attention from the door. She had felt it settle on her in the particular way she had felt rooms settle on her since girlhood, that collective slow assessment. She had kept walking. She had always kept walking. The laughter started before the preacher reached the 2nd line. Vera Alderton had not laughed. She sat with her jaw set and her hands folded. It was the younger sisters, one of them, then both. and then a smothered sound from somewhere behind the left pew and the particular spreading quiet of a congregation deciding what it was going to be. The preacher stopped. Nora stood at the front of the church with the dried flowers in her steady hands and 70 people in the silence behind her, and the preacher looking at his book and not at her. And she looked straight ahead at the cross above the door and felt the room settle into that awful waiting. Wyatt Cade turned his head, not toward the congregation, toward her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the venison stew at the repaired pantry hinge, at Thomas moving 3 inches across the porch, with the full, patient attention of a man who has been watching something longer than he has let on. Then he leaned in, very slightly, and his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "You're mine now," he said. "Let them look." It was not a grand declaration. It was 4 words and a fact, said the way he said everything. Plainly, without theater, with the full weight of a man who kept his word. But the church was very quiet. And in a very quiet church, even a whisper carries further than a whisper means to. And the 2 women in the front right pew, the preacher's wife and her sister, heard every word of it. And the preacher himself heard the last 2. And the silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Not the silence of a room waiting to see what would happen. The silence of a room that had just understood something. Wyatt turned back to the preacher. "Continue," he said. The preacher continued. The Aldertons left before the small reception the churchwomen had arranged in the fellowship hall. They did not speak to Nora on their way out. Vera Alderton paused at the door, just for a moment, just long enough that it was perceptible, and then went out into the cold without looking back. The preacher's wife found Nora beside the table of biscuits and cake and pressed her hand with both of hers. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The congregation rearranged itself in the way that congregations do after a thing they have witnessed. Some people moved closer. Some people moved to the edges. And the ones who had laughed or smiled at the laughter found themselves in the middle of the room without anyone to stand near. The youngest Alderton sister, who had started the laughter and who was not yet 18 and had perhaps not thought through what she was starting, spent the reception alone near the window, looking at the snow outside and not eating any cake. Lily and Thomas had been in the front right pew with the preacher's wife, and Thomas had held his sister's hand through the whole ceremony, with the grip of a boy who understood that something important was happening. And when it was over and Nora came to them, he reached up and took her hand without being asked. Not the way a child takes a stranger's hand. The way a child takes a hand they have been waiting to take. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Wyatt sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and Nora sat across from him with hers, and the fire in the stove spoke in the low, steady language of a fire that has been well laid and will burn until morning. "The Aldertons will settle," he said. "I know," she said. "Vera is not a bad woman." "I know that too." He looked at his coffee. A pause of approximately 30 seconds, which is a long pause in a kitchen at night, but not an uncomfortable one when both people in the room are accustomed to their own company. "I was not looking for someone like her," he said. "I was looking for someone who would stay." Nora looked at him across the table, at the firelight on his face, at the gray at his jaw, and the care behind his eyes that he kept so deeply under that most people never saw it. "I intend to stay," she said. "I know," he said. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He got up and put more wood on the fire. She had not asked. And the room was not cold yet. But he put the wood on anyway. And then he said good night and went upstairs. And she sat for a while in the warm kitchen with the fire talking to itself. And outside the window, the Montana January was what it always was. enormous and dark and indifferent to human arrangements, going about its business of cold and dark and deep silence as it had for 10,000 years and would for 10,000 more. She was not indifferent to this one. The spring came late that year, as it does in that part of Montana, arriving in small, careful increments rather than all at once. A few degrees of warmth, then a week of cold, then warmth again, as though the season was feeling out the territory before committing. By March, the snow was softening. By April, the first mud appeared on the south slope where the sun hit longest. By the middle of May, the ranch was green in the low places where snowmelt collected. And the kitchen garden Nora had laid out in the protected corner behind the house was showing the first thin lines of green against the dark soil. Lily had planted half of it herself, directing operations with a seriousness that Thomas had mostly complied with and occasionally sabotaged. Thomas had eaten a radish directly from the ground and declared it acceptable. Wyatt had stood at the garden fence one evening and watched all three of them in the dirt, and had not said anything for long enough that Nora, who was on her knees staking pea vines, had looked up to make sure he was all right. He was all right. He was just watching. He fixed the garden fence the next morning without mentioning it. He built a proper gate for it the week after. He did not comment on these improvements. Neither did she. Vera Alderton came to call in June, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, and she and Nora sat on the porch with coffee and talked about the weather and the condition of the South Road and the price of hay. And when Vera stood to leave, she looked at Nora for a moment with an expression that had lost most of its edges. "He never looked at me the way he looks at you," she said, not accusingly, with the particular honesty of a woman who has had 4 months to think about something and has arrived at the truth of it. "I do not think he ever would have." Nora did not say anything to this. There was nothing useful to say to it. "You're good for those children," Vera said. Then she went down the porch steps and rode west toward her own land. Lily, who had been sitting inside the open window the entire time, appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds after Vera's horse rounded the bend. "I heard all of that," she said. "I know," Nora said. "She's right about the children," Lily said. "I know that too." Lily considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old who has just confirmed something she suspected. Then she went back inside to whatever she had been doing, and Nora stayed on the porch with her coffee in the June afternoon, in the long, gold, unhurried light that came over the ridge at that hour, and felt the day settle around her the way a well-made garment settles. Nothing pulling, nothing loose, everything exactly as it ought to be. She had been told her whole life, in one way and another, that a woman her size was too much to look at, too much to accommodate, too much to want what she wanted. She had learned not to argue with it. She had simply kept moving, kept working, kept being exactly what she was, and had waited, without quite admitting she was waiting, for the life that had room for all of it. It was this one. It had always been going to be this one. She was enough. She had carried that knowledge privately for 31 years, through every measuring look and every room that fell quiet when she walked into it, through Emporia and the agencies that sent her letters back and the one that never answered, through the Bear Creek Ridge Church in January in her brown traveling dress with dried flowers in her steady hands. She had always been enough. She had simply needed a place willing to hold her